Let's now use modules in practice to make sure that we really understand how they work and to import and export values between them. And let's start with the simplest scenario of all, which is to simply import a module but without importing any value. And so that's also possible, and so let's use that as a starting point here. So let's then create a new module. Okay. So as always, we already start with this script.js, but now as we create a new module, we simply have to create a new file. So new file, and here I will use the example of a shopping cart. And so we're going to have a module called shoppingcart.js. And in module names, it's also a convention to use camel case names. All right. So this one here will be the importing module, and this will be the exporting module. And to start, let's actually log this to the console just so we can see that the module is actually being imported. So this one here will log to the console exporting module, and this one should log to the console importing module. So like this, with the quotes, of course. And now we also have to import that other module. And let's do that here first. So import, and then a string with the location of the module. So /, which simply means the current location, and then here VS Code already gives us these options. So let's choose here shoppingcart.js. And you see that VS Code automatically omits the JS here. So the name is actually this one with the JS, but ES modules actually also work without the extension. But for now, let's actually leave the extension there just to make it a little bit more clear. So let's start this code here. So as always, live server, but then we will see that this is not yet going to work. So let's take a look at the console here. And so we see cannot use import statement outside a module. So why is that happening? Well, remember from the last lecture that when we want to connect a module to the HTML file, we actually need to specify the type attribute. So here we have to say that this is of the type module. Okay. And so now it actually worked. So let's go back here and analyze this. And so here in the console, we see that the first log is actually exporting module. Only then importing module is logged to the console. And so this means that in fact, this code here is executed before any code in the importing module. So exactly what I explained to you in the last lecture. So the code in this module here is parsed, and before it is executed, all the code in the modules that it imports is executed first. All right? And the same is true if we had this log here before. Okay? So remember that all the importing statements are basically hoisted to the top. And so usually this is actually also how we write it. So all the import statements at the top of the file. And also note how I didn't use strict mode here. And that's because, as you learned in the last video, all modules are executed in strict mode by default. But now let's go back here to the shopping cart module and define some variables. So let's just say shipping cost equals 10. And let's also say we have an empty cart, which is like an array. So an empty array for now. Now, variables that are declared inside of a module, so just like these two ones here, are actually scoped to this module. So basically inside a module, the module itself is like the top level scope. And so by default, this means that all top level variables are private inside of this variable. So unlike traditional scripts, which would put all of these variables here in the global scope, but again, not modules. And so that's why right here, we cannot do this. All right, so shipping cost is not defined. All right, so the shipping cost and cart variables are scoped to the current module, basically. And so we can only use them here. Now, if we wanted to use them in the script.js module, then we would have to use exports. And in ES modules, there are two types of exports: named exports and default exports. And named imports is actually the simplest way of exporting something from a module, because all we have to do is to put export in front of anything that we might want to export. So let's say that we want to create this method here, add to cart, and it should be a function that takes a product and a quantity, and then it pushes basically a new object to the cart, so to that cart array. And then let's also log something to the console, like quantity, and then the product was added to the cart. Okay, and so again, by now, this variable is private inside of this module. But if we wanted to now export it so that we can import it in some other module, all we have to do is write export right here. And so this then creates a named export from this module. And so now we can then import that variable right here. We just have to write it with the exact same name. So the variable is called add to cart right here. And so right here in this module. And so therefore we have to call it that here as well. Now what we're missing here is the from. So this is quite easy to understand. It reads just like a normal sentence. So we want to import add to cart from this module. And again, add to cart, this variable name here, has to be exactly the same as this one. Okay, now here we are just missing actually curly braces around this here, like this. And so now it's going to work. And the syntax without the curly braces, we will see a little bit later. But again, with named imports, you have to give them here the same name, and you actually have to put them inside curly braces like this. And so now here we are able to call this function as if it was defined here in this same scope. So let's just say we want to add 5 breads to that shopping cart, and now indeed it works. So here we get that log now that is coming from the add to cart function that is indeed defined in this module here. Now just keep in mind that exports always need to happen in top level code. So it wouldn't work like this. All right. So then indeed you get an unexpected token export. So let's put it back, of course. And so now here we are back. And of course, we can also export multiple things from a module using named exports. And actually, that is the main use case of named exports. So basically, when we want to export multiple things. Okay, now we can also export multiple things at the same time using named exports. So we can just, let's say, declare some variables here, like total price 237 and total quantity, let's say 23. And so now we can export all of this at the same time, again using named exports by writing total price and total quantity. So this is a little bit like exporting an object from this module. And so now, just like before, we can then come here and import these variables using the same name. And again, that's inside of the curly braces, just like we exported here. So that's add to cart, total price, and total quantity. And so of course we can then go ahead and use them here. And in this case, all we do is to log them. But indeed, now we get access to these values from here. And indeed, now we get access to these values here in this main importing module. Now, actually, we can change the name of the imports as well. So for example, if we wanted to call the total price simply price, we could write this. So total price as price. And so then here, it would no longer be called total price, right? So it's no longer there, but instead it is simply called price. And we could actually even do that here in the exports. So here we could also write like export total quantity just as QT, let's say. And so then here it would no longer be called total quantity, but TQ. And now that doesn't work, so let's go back. So it's TQ, so total quantity. And so now indeed we are back to having 23 there. So this is all very flexible, as you can see, and we can play around with this as we wish. Okay, and actually we can take this importing even further, because we can also import all the exports of a module at the same time. So that's import, and then everything. So that's usually the meaning of the star, and then S, and here we can give it some name that we want. So let's call it shopping cart, and with a capital S here. So a little bit like a class name, okay? So that's kind of the convention when we import everything into an object like this. So basically this here will create an object containing everything that is exported from the module that we will specify here. So from shopping cart. And so this will then basically create a namespace for all of the values exported from that module. Let's just comment out this one here, and I will put this code that is more related to this import here. So actually I want all of it here. So put that here and comment it out like this, because now we are doing it differently. Let's just put everything here, just so we get some new code here. Now it tells us that this module doesn't exist, and that's because by default VS Code again removed this JS. And in fact, it is necessary. It is only not necessary in some other cases that we will see later. So now it works again, and we are back to having our logs here. And so now whenever we want to use something that was exported, like this add to cart function, then we have to basically take that from this object. So add to cart, and let's again say bread 5. All right, so here it is again. And so basically if we think about this, this module here is now basically exporting a public API just like a class. So it's as if this object here was an object created from a class, which now has these methods and also, for example, these properties like shopping cart dot total price, right? So that's the other named export from this module. Now, of course, we are not trying to replace classes with modules. I just wanted to turn your attention to the fact that some things here look pretty similar indeed, right? And actually, we can say that a module exports kind of a public API, because everything else, of course, stays private inside of the module. All right, and that's basically how named imports and exports work. So we saw how we can export just one value, and also how we can export multiple values at once, and also how we can change the name of the named exports and also of the named import like this. Then we learned how we can import everything at the same time, so all the named imports at once. All right, And so now it's time to talk about default exports. So I said that they were named exports and default exports. And so let's now talk a little bit about these export defaults. So usually we use default exports when we only want to export one thing per module. And so that's the reason why they are called default. And so it works like this. So pretty similar, but then we have to write default. And then here we want to simply export a value. So for example, if we wanted to export the same function, we would simply export the value itself. So not the variable. And here you see that no name is involved at all. We are simply exporting this value. And so then when we import it, we can basically give it any name that we want. So let's say import add from shoppingcart.js. And so this will then import the default export no matter what that's called. And in fact, it's not called anything. And so yeah, we can give it any name here that we want. And right now, we are actually importing the same module here twice, as you see. Now that's not a problem, as you see here now, but usually we don't do that. Okay, so we didn't get any error, but it is also not advisable, I would say. So let's take this out here for now. And now let's once again try to actually use the value that we imported here. So let's add 2 pizzas, and here they are. All right. And we could even mix all of them in the same import statement. So if we wanted, we could have default and named imports and exports all at the same time. So here we would just have to take this one and then put that here after a comma, and then we could take a look, for example, at the price once again. All right. However, in practice, we usually never mix named and default exports in the same module. So this is not really desirable here. So let me just comment it just so you see that we can do it. But I will then leave it as it was before. All right. So of course now the price is not defined. But now we should be good to go. So the preferred style is actually to just use one default export per module and then import that here like we did. And in fact, that's the reason why it is easier to import a default export. So here we don't even need to use the curly braces, and the designers of the specification did that on purpose. So again, to make it easier to import default exports. But of course, that's not a rigid rule that we always need to follow. So we can do whatever is best for any given situation. However, what you probably should really not do is to mix default and named exports like we did here. So avoid that to reduce complexity, but besides that, you can use named exports or default exports, whatever works best in your situations. Now, of course, we will use all of this in the real world in our next big project, and so by then you will get a good feeling for how all of this works a little bit better in the real world. All right. But with this, you now already have a pretty good idea of how importing and exporting values between modules actually works. But before finishing this lecture, I actually also wanted to prove you that imports are, in fact, a live connection to exports. So that's something that I mentioned by the end of last video, and it's something really important to keep in mind. And so let's take a look at this. And so actually what I will start doing is to now export this card array here. All right. So here now it looks as if we are simply exporting this empty array here. So cart is an empty array, and that's all we are exporting here. But now watch what happens as we add a couple more products. So let's say bread, 5, and then just a couple of apples. And so watch what happens when we now import this card and log it to the console. So actually, let's do that here. So I mentioned we should not mix them, but now just to make this work, we actually need to. So we're mixing a default export and a named export, but never mind. Okay, so everything is added to the card, and now let's log the card and see what happens. So here we do not see that empty object that we exported, but instead we have this array with the objects that we just added to the card by calling the add function here. And so that proves that this import here is in fact not simply a copy of the value that we exported here, right? Because if it was, then here we would simply get that empty array, right? Because that's what this card variable looked like by the time we exported it. But as I mentioned in the last lecture, it is not simply a copy. It is a live connection. And as we call this function that we called add in the other module, we keep pushing objects to that array. So we are mutating that array here. And so then here, of course, we see that manipulating the array in the console as we log the card here. And so they are, in fact, the exact same object behind the scenes, basically. So one more time, repeat it with me. Imports are not copies of the export. They are instead like a live connection. And so what that means is that they point to the same place in memory. Because, again, otherwise, if it was a copy, then here we would not get anything in the array. And so keep this in mind when you write your own programs, because this can, of course, lead to bugs if you don't know what you're doing and if you don't know that this is how it actually works. All right. And so with this, we actually finished this video, which was a pretty important one, because this is the foundation of how we organize a modern JavaScript codebase. So make sure to review this lecture thoroughly, and I would actually like you to play around a little bit on your own with exporting and importing some more values like we just did here. And after that, I see you then in the next video.